Hello, everyone. I'm ZHAO Chuang. Today, we are going to draw the skull of Allosaurus. A distinctive feature of Allosaurus was its head. In front of its eyes, at this position, there were two relatively large lacrimal horns. Unlike the large and sharp lacrimal horns shown on the reconstructed model, they are smaller on the skull fossil. Because when alive, some keratins were covering here that made it look bigger. On the reconstructed model, we can see that its face was directly covered with skin and flesh. When alive, it had many huge holes in its face, including the antorbital fenestrae in front of its eyes, the large nostrils in the foremost, and the temporal fenestra behind the eyes. Now, let's draw the skull of Allosaurus. Its skull was very characteristic, which was a very typical skull of carnivorous dinosaurs. First, let's determine the approximate size of the skull, and take a brief look at its structure. If we set the skull this long, the height should be drawn a bit shorter. There are two species of Allosaurus, the most common being Allosaurus fragilis, which had a taller and more pointed skull. This time, we are going to draw Allosaurus jamasoni. Its skull was flatter, and the hole looked square, and not so sharp. Now, let's draw it bit by bit. We start by drawing its eyes. First are the sclerotic rings of its eyes. The sclerotic ring fossils of Allosaurus were rarely found, but it was a common structure of dinosaurs. Sclerotic rings are a bony structure on the eyeballs, which are relatively commonly seen in reptiles and birds. Its main function was to fix the eyeball and connect the eye with the surrounding muscles. Its eyes looked big, but when it was alive, the exposed part was the area in the middle, which was small. Its eye sockets were larger than its sclerotic rings. This was its postorbital bone. A small lump above the eye. Several bones in front of the eyes formed the front half of the orbit, and the most striking one is here. This bone, called the lacrimal bone, was a structure found in many dinosaurs. When Allosaurus was alive, the lacrimal bone was probably very large and striking, acting like a crest. Then moving forward and downward, this is its maxilla, which was a relatively large triangle. Below was its jugal bone, and going backward, the quadrate bone and occipital bone formed its temporal fenestra. There are actually two kinds of temporal fenestrae. One is the lateral temporal fenestra, and the other the supratemporal fenestra, so these reptiles are also called diapsids, referring to their two sets of temporal fenestrae. The main function of the temporal fenestra is to immobilize the muscles. Then we come back to the maxilla, which had a lot of teeth. The upper teeth of Allosaurus were grown onto bones, which were mainly distributed on the maxilla, and then the premaxilla. Here, The teeth on the premaxilla were smaller, and the ones on the maxilla were larger. The premaxilla and maxilla were two bones that all dinosaurs had, but they were not the same shape. The two bones of Allosaurus connected into a relatively complete shape, but there were still certain corners, and in the late dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex, the two bones connected tightly and almost fused into a whole. The earlier and more primitive the dinosaur species, the more loosely the two bones were connected. Take the early Dilophosaurus, for example. Its two bones formed a relatively large gap. The two bones of other dinosaurs also formed gaps in this position. For example, this structure of Spinosaurus evolved into a unique structure that could catch fish. The area between the premaxilla and the maxilla formed the nostril. At this location, there was actually a concave here in the premaxilla. So when it was alive, the opening of the nostrils was in this position. Its nostrils looked large, but the openings were actually lower. It went up and back, all the way to the frontal bone, forming the entire head of Allosaurus. When the mouth was closed, its lower jaw was fully wrapped in. The bone at the front of the lower jaw was the dentary bone. All the teeth of the lower jaw grew on the dentary bone. When the mouth was closed, the upper teeth would block the lower teeth, which was also a big difference between dinosaurs and living lizards. When living lizards close their mouth, the upper and lower jaws generally have a mutual curved structure, so there is a gap formed between them, preventing their teeth from fully interlocking. But the dinosaurs' upper jaw and lower jaw formed a stronger structure. This was the angular bone, which extended back and formed a joint with this. In fact, the joint of Allosaurus was in this position, and this was the fulcrum when it opened its mouth. Backward was its cervical vertebra. We won't draw it in detail, and we only need to know that the occipital bone was the joint, and the cervical vertebrae were connected here. The first cervical vertebra in front was generally called the atlas. Normally, the cervical vertebrae were counted from the second vertebra, which is called C2. Together with the following ones they constituted its neck. There were cervical ribs below the cervical vertebrae. And the entire vertebral body was blocked by the cervical ribs. Good, like this, we've finished drawing the skull of Allosaurus.